There is this really prevailing image we always see of the United States and the Middle East.
Right, the sort of exasperated parent image.
Yeah, exactly. Like you have these two unruly kids, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is just sitting at the head of the table.
Just trying to be the honest broker.
Right. Trying to get them to share the toys. I mean, it's the standard narrative you see on the news every single night, the whole peace process framing.
It is the narrative. And, it's comfortable, it's familiar. It frames the whole conflict as this tragedy of good intentions.
But then you pick up a book like the one we're doing a deep dive on today, Gaza in Crisis.
Right.
And you have Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. I mean, these are two absolute heavyweights in their respective fields.
They really are.
And they basically take that whole honest broker narrative, throw it on the ground, and just stomp on it.
They don't just stomp on it. They completely dismantle it structurally.
Yeah.
Their argument in the source material isn't that the U.S. is just, failing to make peace. It's that the U.S. is actively the primary rejectionist state in the world.
Which, I mean, that word rejectionist just stopped me cold when I first read this.
Yeah, it's a very specific choice of words.
Because usually in geopolitical speak, rejectionist is what we call Iran.
Or arguably Hamas, the rejectionist front.
Exactly. But Chomsky kind of flips the lens here.
He really does. He says if you actually look at the voting records, like the raw data at the UN, it's the U.S. and Israel standing alone against basically the entire world.
And we are definitely going to dig deep into that data. But the book we are covering today isn't just about the U.S. role.
No, it's much broader.
It's basically a structural autopsy of the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, looking specifically at the crises in Gaza around 2008 and 2009.
But to understand that specific crisis, both authors argue that you really have to understand the architecture that was built 60 years prior.
Right. We aren't here today to debate, who fired a rocket yesterday afternoon.
Exactly. We are looking at the structural history. We're talking about military blueprints from 1948.
The Christian Zionist connection.
Yes, that lobby that existed before the State of Israel even did, and the systematic sort of ghettoization of Palestine.
Now, just a quick note before we fully dive into all of this for you, the listener.
That's a very important note.
Yeah. This is heavy, emotionally charged material. We're dealing with war, displacement, concepts like politicide.
It's very intense subject matter.
So our mission here today is simply to act as a conduit for the arguments presented by Chomsky and Pappé.
Right. We are absolutely not taking sides here.
Not at all. We are entirely impartial. These are two very specific, very critical perspectives from the source material.
You've got Chomsky focusing on the geopolitical macro level and Pappé on the historical micro level.
And we're just here to unpack the historical data and arguments they provide.
Exactly. So let's start where Ilan Pappé insists we must start. The root cause.
The Nakba.
Right. Pappé argues that the fundamental flaw in almost all Western analysis, and certainly in the framework of the peace process, is that we treat the conflict as if it started in 1967.
Right, the Six-Day War.
Yes. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza.
Because the logic usually goes like, if Israel just leaves the territories they captured in 67, then boom, peace breaks out.
Precisely. But Pappé says that is a massive trap.
He argues you cannot understand Gaza today without understanding 1948.
He literally calls 1948 the ghost at the table.
Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. And for a really long time, at least here in the West, this was treated as a sort of unfortunate byproduct of war.
Right, the classic narrative.
The story was always the Arab armies attacked the newborn state of Israel, and in all the chaos, Palestinians just fled.
Or even worse, the narrative that Arab leaders actively broadcasted orders telling them to leave.
Which was the dominant narrative in Israel and the U.S. for decades.
It was, but this is exactly where Pappé's background as a new historian becomes crucial.
Because of what happened in the 1990s.
Yes. In the 90s, the Israeli State Archives declassified a ton of documents from the founding of the state.
And Pappé, along with other historians like Benny Morris, went in to look at them.
And what they found completely contradicted that whole voluntary flight story.
Found Plan Dalet.
Plan Dalet.
I was looking at the notes on this. It was finalized on March 10th, 1948.
Right.
This wasn't just some vague political memo. This was a highly detailed military blueprint.
It was. Plan D, or Dalet, was the master plan for the Haganah.
The Jewish paramilitary forces that eventually became the IDF.
Exactly. And according to Pappé's analysis of the primary source text, it was a literal blueprint for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
It gave very specific operational orders. And the language is It's chillingly bureaucratic.
It doesn't say defend our new borders.
No. It lists methods for surrounding a village, conducting a search, and then in the event of resistance, which the book notes was very loosely defined.
Destruction of the village and expulsion of the inhabitants.
It explicitly discusses setting fire to homes and planting landmines in the rubble to prevent people from returning.
Pappé argues that this proves the refugee crisis wasn't some accidental byproduct of the fog of war. It was a core strategic objective.
Because of the demographic issue.
Exactly. The goal was demographic transformation. You simply cannot have a Jewish state with a clear majority if the indigenous Arab population remains in place.
So Plan Dalet was the mechanical mechanism to solve that demographic problem.
Which leads to a really fascinating psychological concept that the book explores extensively.
Dual memory.
Yes, this is absolutely critical for understanding the Israeli psyche today, according to Pappé.
On one hand, 1948 is the miracle.
Right. It's independence, it's redemption, the few defeating the many.
But simultaneously, there's this dark shadow, the taboo.
Because to maintain the moral high ground of the miracle, society has to aggressively suppress the memory of the massive dispossession that made the miracle possible.
It's like a split consciousness. You celebrate the land you won, but you have to completely ignore who was living on it the day before you got there.
And that denial, according to the source, isn't just psychological, it's physical.
Right. Pappé details the Hebraization of the map.
This part is incredible.
It really blew my mind. It wasn't just about winning the war, it was about establishing this sort of retroactive continuity.
Ben-Gurion actually appointed an official naming committee.
Because after the war, they had a landscape covered in ruins. Over 500 destroyed Palestinian villages.
And they didn't just leave them be, they took the Arabic names and Hebraized them.
So, like, the Palestinian village of Lubia becomes the Kibbutz Lavi.
Sephoria becomes Zippori.
They literally wiped the Arabic geography off the map and superimposed a biblical one.
It's like they were hitting restore factory settings to 2,000 years ago, deliberately deleting everything in between.
It legitimized the new ownership by claiming it was actually just the old ownership returning.
Exactly. And then there's the Green Lung Project.
The trees. We always hear about planting trees in Israel as this great, beautiful environmental act.
Make the desert bloom.
Right. It is a very powerful brand. The Jewish National Fund planted millions of pine trees.
But Pappé points out a darker reality. Many of these forests, these green lungs, were planted directly over the ruins of those destroyed Palestinian villages.
That is such a potent image. You're looking at a beautiful pine forest, but it's actually acting as a camouflage net made of roots and barks.
And it serves a double function. First, it physically hides the rubble, making it significantly harder for refugees to claim their land or even find their old homes.
And the second function?
It Europeanizes the landscape. Pine trees look very different than the indigenous olive terraces and scrub brush.
It makes the land look less Arab and more distinctively European.
It's terraforming as a literal tool of historical erasure.
And there was legal erasure, too. The book talks about the Prevention of Infiltration law.
Right. In the early years, the state passed laws that defined any Palestinian trying to return to their home, even just to harvest their own crops or retrieve a blanket, as an infiltrator.
It basically criminalized their mere existence on their own land. If you try to go home, you are by definition a criminal.
So connecting this back to the present day, or at least to the framework of the peace process, Pappé's saying that because we ignore all of this, the peace process is inherently doomed.
Because we act like the conflict started in 1967.
Precisely. If you frame the conflict merely as the occupation of the West Bank, then the logical solution is just end the occupation.
But the people in Gaza,
Yeah.
the vast majority of them aren't originally from Gaza.
Right. They are refugees from 1948. Their families come from the villages that are now sitting under those pine forests in Israel proper.
So the peace process essentially says to them, we can talk about your future, but we absolutely cannot talk about your past.
And for the Palestinians, the right of return isn't just some political bargaining chip. It's the fundamental acknowledgement of their original trauma.
By taking 1948 completely off the table, the U.S. and Israel are effectively asking the Palestinians to legitimize their own dispossession.
That's exactly why Pappé calls the peace process a trap.
That actually segues perfectly into the other half of this book, the role of the United States.
Right. If Pappé handles the history of the land, Chomsky handles the history of the diplomacy.
And we have to go back to that rejectionist idea we mentioned at the top.
It's classic Chomsky, his signature move.
He loves to take a word that the mainstream media uses one way and prove that, by its strict dictionary definition, it actually applies to the complete opposite side.
So let's define rejectionist in this specific context.
Because the U.S. is the one hosting Camp David, right? The Wye River Memorandum, Annapolis. They are always the ones holding the diplomatic clipboard.
But Chomsky defines rejectionism very specifically as the rejection of the international consensus.
But isn't consensus kind of subjective in geopolitics?
Not when you look at the United Nations. Chomsky points directly to the annual voting record of the UN General Assembly. Every single year, there is a resolution proposed called the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine.
And what does it say?
It calls for a strict two-state solution on the 1967 borders with international guarantees and minor mutual border adjustments.
And the voting numbers on this are just staggering. I was looking at the data from the book. It's consistently something like 160 nations voting yes.
Right. Europe votes yes. The Arab League votes yes. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation votes yes.
Even Hamas.
Yes, even Hamas has signaled repeatedly that they would accept this specific border arrangement as a long-term hudna, or truce.
So who exactly is voting no?
The United States, Israel, and usually a tiny scattering of Pacific Island nations that are entirely dependent on U.S. aid. Places like Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Palau.
That's it.
That is it. It's the U.S. and Israel standing alone against the rest of the world.
So when Chomsky calls the U.S. a rejectionist, he means the U.S. is actively using its veto power to block the specific solution that everyone else on the planet agrees on.
Exactly. The U.S. insists that the peace process must be run exclusively by the U.S., not the UN.
Why is that?
Because in the UN, the U.S. is outvoted. In a U.S.-run process, the U.S. gets to set all the rules.
Which allows them to frame Israeli security demands as the absolute prerequisite for everything else.
Effectively vetoing the settlement that international law dictates.
But why? Why is the U.S. so locked into this position? The book details these things called clusters of history.
It's not just one single reason. It's a layer cake of historical reasons.
And the very first layer is one that I think most people have never even heard of. The Blackstone-Schofield legacy.
Christian Zionism.
We generally think of U.S. support for Israel as a product of the Jewish lobby, AIPAC, or maybe post-World War II guilt regarding the Holocaust.
But Pappé points out that American support for a Jewish return to Palestine significantly predates the State of Israel.
It predates the Zionist movement itself.
Yes. This brings us to William Blackstone.
The Blackstone Memorial of 1891.
William Blackstone was a very prominent American evangelical. He actively lobbied President Benjamin Harrison to help the Jews return to Palestine.
But his motivation wasn't about protecting Jews from anti-Semitism, was it?
No, not at all. It was entirely eschatological. It was about the end times.
Right.
The theology holds that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is the necessary trigger for the second coming of Christ.
Which is a bit of a double-edged sword for the Jewish people in that specific theology.
To put it very mildly, in that narrative, once the Jews return and the apocalypse begins, they essentially have two choices.
Convert to Christianity or be destroyed in the fires of Armageddon.
Exactly. It's actually deeply anti-Semitic in its ultimate endgame.
But in the short term?
In the short term, it creates this massive, highly fervent base of support for Zionism among American Christians. This cultural bedrock was firmly in place long before AIPAC ever existed.
So that's the theological layer. Then you have the strategic layer, what the book calls the Five Sisters.
The major oil companies. This is the pure realpolitik layer.
Right. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. officially identifies Middle East oil as a stupendous source of strategic power.
And to protect that power, they needed a cop on the beat.
That's the exact phrase used.
The U.S. knew it couldn't just colonize the region directly. The age of formal colonialism was ending.
They needed a reliable local proxy.
A Western-oriented military power that could essentially discipline the region. Israel proved beyond a doubt that it could be that power, especially after it decimated the Arab armies in 1967.
It became a vital strategic asset to keep Arab nationalism in check.
So you have the Bible, and you have the barrel, God and oil.
And then the book mentions the King Crane legacy from 1919.
Right, the road not taken. Woodrow Wilson sent a commission to Palestine in 1919 to see what the locals actually wanted.
And the commission found that the indigenous population overwhelmingly rejected the idea of a Jewish state.
But that report was essentially buried, ignored, a massive historical what if.
And much later, you add the lobby AIPAC, which institutionalizes all this support in Washington.
During the Nixon and Kissinger era, the influence shifted heavily from the Arabists in the State Department directly to the pro-Israel lobby.
But Chomsky and Pappé argue the lobby is basically pushing on an open door.
Exactly. The strategic and cultural alignment was already firmly established. They also mention the liberal or realist legacy.
Where even liberal academics frame the conflict in a way that prioritizes Israeli security over Palestinian human rights.
Right. Now, let's zoom in a bit. The book is titled Gaza in Crisis, and a huge chunk of the text is dedicated specifically to the 2008-2009 assault.
Operation Cast Lead.
This is where the macro-structural analysis meets the brutal physical reality on the ground.
The timeline the authors lay out here is crucial, because the mainstream media story was very simple at the time.
Hamas fired rockets, and Israel had absolutely no choice but to defend itself.
But Chomsky completely tears that timeline apart.
He does. He points back to June 2008. Egypt had brokered a formal ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
And the terms were pretty straightforward. Hamas stops firing rockets, and in exchange, Israel lifts the blockade to allow basic supplies into Gaza. And did it work?
According to the Israeli government's own official spokesperson, Mark Regev, is directly cited in the book. Hamas largely held up their end of the bargain.
Rocket fire dropped to effectively zero for months.
It was quiet.
But Israel didn't lift the siege.
That is the critical failure Chomsky points to. Exports from Gaza remained completely blocked. Food was kept at a mere trickle. The economic diet continued unabated.
And then on November 4th,
which, as the book notes, was not coincidentally election night in the U.S.
Right, when the entire world was glued to their televisions watching Obama win the presidency.
Under the cover of that media distraction, Israel broke the truce.
They launched a military raid directly into Gaza.
They killed 6 Hamas members. They claimed it was a preemptive move to destroy a tunnel.
But the reality is that raid broke the ceasefire.
Hamas immediately retaliated with rocket fire, and that predictable escalation gave Israel the exact pretext it needed for Cast Lead.
Chomsky's core point here is that Israeli security could have been easily maintained by simply honoring the truce and lifting the siege.
But Israel actively chose escalation. And Chomsky notes this wasn't spontaneous.
No, the Israeli press reported that the operation had been meticulously planned for over 6 months.
And when Cast Lead actually started, the timing was incredibly calculated.
It started on a Saturday morning.
The Sabbath. Right when children were leaving school, specifically to maximize the element of shock.
And it wasn't just a military operation targeting rocket launchers. They targeted the Dawa.
This is a very key concept for listeners to grasp. Dawa refers to the social and administrative wing of Hamas.
Because Hamas isn't just a militant group hiding in tunnels, it runs clinics.
It runs schools, police stations, welfare programs. It functions as the actual civil government of Gaza.
And Israel's argument during the war was that because Hamas runs these civil services, the people running them are fundamentally part of a terrorist organization.
Exactly. They treated the entire civil administration of the territory as a legitimate military target.
On the very first day of the war, they bombed a police cadet graduation ceremony.
These weren't combatants firing missiles. They were just traffic cops in training standing in formation.
Dozens of them were killed instantly. Chomsky calls that total war.
If you define the basic civil administration of a city as a terrorist infrastructure, you have effectively legalized the destruction of society itself.
And that aligns perfectly with the going crazy doctrine mentioned in the text.
Right. Sometimes referred to alongside the Dahiya doctrine.
This specific phrasing, going crazy, refers to the strategic idea that it is sometimes beneficial for Israel to appear highly irrational.
To use massively disproportionate force, the ultimate goal is pure deterrence.
You want the enemy population to be so completely terrified of your reaction that they wouldn't dare lift a single finger against you.
The book highlights the immense disparity in casualties during this operation, something like a 100-to-1 ratio.
Which explains the use of white phosphorus.
It does. The use of white phosphorus during Cast Lead was extensively documented by human rights groups and heavily cited by the authors.
For listeners who might not know the specifics, can you explain what white phosphorus actually is?
White phosphorus is a highly toxic incendiary chemical.
It's technically legal to use as a smokescreen on a traditional battlefield to hide troop movements, right?
Yes, but it is strictly illegal under international law to use it in densely populated civilian areas.
Because of what it does to the human body.
It burns at roughly 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It sticks to human skin.
And if it touches you?
It burns until it literally hits bone or until it is completely deprived of oxygen.
And water doesn't put it out?
No. And Israel used this weapon in Gaza.
One of the most densely populated urban environments on Earth.
The book details its use hitting the UNRWA compound and the Al-Quds hospital.
The sheer psychological terror of that specific weapon, the fact that you cannot put the fire out, is a core part of that shock and deterrence strategy.
There's also another deeply cynical layer to the Gaza War that the book touches on, a theory regarding natural gas.
Right, the follow the money angle.
In 1999, the BG Group British Gas discovered a very significant natural gas field right off the coast of Gaza.
A resource worth billions of dollars.
But as long as Gaza is controlled by Hamas, or is locked in a state of perpetual conflict,
Israel can't safely access it, and the Palestinians certainly can't monetize it.
the book suggests that part of the long-term motivation for the invasion and the ongoing naval siege is to firmly secure control over those territorial waters and that resource.
It's about permanently preventing the Palestinians from ever having an independent economic lifeline.
Which brings us back to the siege itself. The authors argue forcefully that the siege isn't just a temporary security measure.
It is an act of war.
It is deliberate economic strangulation. The book quotes Dov Weisglass, a top advisor to the Israeli prime minister.
He famously said the goal was to put the Palestinians on a diet.
A diet. The idea was to mathematically calculate the minimum number of calories needed to prevent literal mass starvation.
Because mass starvation would look terrible on international television.
Right, but they wanted to keep the population just at the absolute edge of hunger, keep the economy from ever functioning.
It's a calculated policy of de-development, destroying the fishing industry, shooting at fishermen if they go beyond 3 miles from the coast.
And there was that other quote the host brings up, the drugged roaches quote.
Yeah, that was from Raphael Eaton, a former IDF chief of staff.
He said that the Palestinians should be treated like drugged roaches in a bottle. Yitzhak Shamir called them grasshoppers that could be crushed.
It's intensely dehumanizing language.
It is, but it's also highly descriptive of the actual military strategy. You lock them in a bottle, you tightly contain them, and you crush them whenever they move.
Let's zoom out again. We've talked a lot about 1948, the U.S. vetoes, and the specifics of Gaza. But what about the West Bank?
The book draws a very clear distinction between the two territories.
While Gaza is described as an open-air prison, locked tightly from the outside, the West Bank is described as a ghetto.
It is Canton from the inside.
This is where we need to introduce the concept of the matrix of control.
That's a term coined by anthropologist Jeff Halper, which both Chomsky and Pappé utilize.
It describes the physical, day-to-day reality of the occupation. It's not just about having soldiers on street corners.
It's the infrastructure itself.
The settlements.
The settlements are the anchor, yes, but it's also the bypass roads.
These are modern, multi-lane highways that cut directly through the West Bank, smoothly connecting the settlements to Israel proper.
But the key is that Palestinians are largely forbidden from using them.
They have to use older, poorly maintained, winding roads that constantly funnel them through military checkpoints.
So you essentially have two completely separate parallel road networks operating in the exact same territory, one for the occupiers and another for the occupied.
And then there is the separation wall,
which the World Court has declared illegal.
And the administrative division of the land into areas A, B, and C.
Which effectively chops the West Bank up into dozens of isolated little islands.
That's dense.
Yes, isolated pockets of Palestinian population. You literally cannot drive from a Palestinian city like Nablus to Ramallah without passing through Israeli military control points.
And a major part of this geographic strangulation is the Jordan Valley strategy.
This is absolutely critical to the geography of the occupation. Israel has maintained strict control over the Jordan Valley, which forms the entire eastern border of the West Bank.
By holding that specific valley, they completely encircle the Palestinian population.
The Palestinians are physically cut off from Jordan and the rest of the Arab world.
So if you just look at a map, the Palestinians are living in these disconnected bubbles, surrounded by overwhelming Israeli military control on all 360 degrees.
Exactly. And this brings us to Pappé's concept of pragmatic Zionism.
We need to contrast that with the other kinds of Zionism people usually hear about.
Well, usually when we talk about hardliners, we think of the revisionist Zionists.
The Likud party, Netanyahu.
Right. They are vocal about wanting the whole land, building an iron wall, no compromises.
But Pappé argues a really counterintuitive point. He says the labor Zionists, the so-called political doves who founded the state, were actually far more effective at displacement.
Because their strategy was highly pragmatic. The motto was basically maximum land, minimal Arabs.
They realized they couldn't just formally annex the densely populated Palestinian cities like Nablus or Gaza.
Because if they annexed them, they'd legally have to give all those people citizenship, and Israel would instantly lose its Jewish demographic majority.
So the strategy was to keep the valuable land around the cities.
Secure the water resources, the strategic military heights, the fertile agricultural zones.
And just leave the actual people trapped inside these autonomous, totally disconnected urban zones.
Which leads to the biggest geopolitical question of all. Is the two-state solution completely dead?
Everyone still talks about the two-state solution like it's just around the corner. Do these authors think it's still alive?
The consensus in the book is incredibly clear. Yes, it is dead. They argue it's a corpse.
Why are they so certain?
Because of the facts on the ground, the settlements.
There's simply too many of them now.
And they are built far too deeply inside the territory. There are over 500,000 settlers currently living in the West Bank.
The land is so fragmented. It's so Swiss cheesed with Israeli infrastructure that there is literally no contiguous territory left to build a functioning sovereign state on. So if it's dead, what exactly is the peace process? A zombie.
Pappé argues it's worse than a zombie. It's a deliberate shield.
A shield for what?
As long as there is an ongoing process, Israel can constantly say to the international community, look, we are at the negotiating table, just give us time.
And while the diplomats negotiate endlessly in fancy hotels, the bulldozers keep working on the ground.
The diplomatic process provides the perfect cover for the colonization to continue uninterrupted.
The authors draw a very heavy comparison to South Africa here, don't they?
Yes, the Bantustan model. And this is a really important distinction for listeners to grasp.
When people hear the word apartheid, they usually just think of racism or separate benches in a park.
But the grand apartheid strategy in South Africa was actually technically a two-state solution.
That is a very provocative way to put it.
But it's historically true. The white South African government created homelands, the Bantustans, places like Transkei, Bophuthatswana.
They gave them flags, national anthems, they even appointed presidents.
And they said to the world, look, you black South Africans have your own independent states now. You are citizens of Transkei. You are no longer citizens of South Africa.
Wait, but it was a complete sham.
Entirely. Those states had absolutely no control over their borders, their water supply, their airspace, or their macroeconomy.
They were just vassal states designed to strip black people of their South African citizenship and stash them in the poorest, most barren land.
And the authors argue that the state currently being offered to Palestinians in the peace process, the exact one the U.S. constantly pushes for, is exactly that.
A modern Bantustan. A state in name only. You get a flag, but you get zero sovereignty.
So if the two-state solution is truly dead, physically killed by the expansion of settlements, then what is left?
This brings us to Section 5 of the book, The Future.
The one-state solution.
Which sounds to a lot of people like a radical, unworkable idea. But the book says it actually has very deep historical roots.
It does. Long before 1948, there were prominent Jewish thinkers like Yehuda Magnus and Martin Buber who actively supported binationalism.
The idea was that Jews and Arabs would share the entirety of the land in a single democratic state with totally equal rights.
A state designed to protect the culture and safety of both peoples. They warned back then that creating a purely Jewish ethno-state would inevitably lead to perpetual war.
But today, that sounds almost impossible. You have two populations that, let's be brutally honest, are deeply traumatized and radicalized against each other.
Politically, it seems impossible. But the argument Pappé makes is that the physical reality on the ground has already created one state.
Israel currently controls everything, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea.
Everyone lives under the same electricity grid, uses the same currency, drives on the same basic highway system.
The only question left is, what kind of regime is governing that single state?
Is it an apartheid regime where half the population has no civil rights? Or can it somehow become a true democracy where everyone has a vote?
And this is the core moral argument the authors make at the end of the book.
They argue that a Jewish state, a state that structurally privileges one specific ethnicity, cannot be a true democracy if it rules over a massive indigenous minority.
You can choose to be a Jewish state, or you can choose to be a democratic state.
But you cannot logically be both if you are perpetually occupying millions of people who aren't Jewish and denying them basic human rights.
The book talks about these people called the desperados.
People who strongly supported the two-state solution for decades, but now look at the map, realize it's physically impossible, and join the one-state movement simply out of logical necessity.
So how do we actually get there? Because the Israeli public certainly isn't voting for a one-state solution anytime soon. The electorate is moving further and further to the political right.
Pappé argues forcefully that change will simply not come from within Israel itself.
The benefits of the occupation, the free land, the cheap labor, the water resources are just too high, and the costs are too low.
He argues it requires massive external pressure.
BDS.
Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Pappé points right back to the South African model.
Apartheid didn't end because the white government suddenly woke up and developed a moral conscience.
No, it ended because the economic and cultural price of maintaining apartheid became far too high due to global isolation.
He argues the exact same tactic is needed here to force a change in the internal Israeli calculus.
Alongside the need to resell the past. We have to educate the world that the conflict didn't start in 1967, it started in 1948.
And Chomsky adds a deeply philosophical point here regarding U.S. and Israeli actions. He calls it depraved indifference.
This is a chilling but incredibly important ethical distinction. Chomsky argues that the U.S. and Israel aren't necessarily trying to kill Palestinian civilians out of pure malice, like some sort of serial killer.
He says it's actually worse. It's complete indifference.
It's like walking down the street and stepping on ants.
You don't actively hate the ants. You don't wish them evil.
You just don't care that they are there. Their lives, their aspirations, their deaths simply do not factor into the calculation of your grand strategic goals.
That implies a total structural dehumanization.
It does. And that is exactly why he uses the phrase, exterminate all the brutes, as a chapter title.
It perfectly captures that old colonial mindset where the native population is just an annoying obstacle to be managed or removed.
Not actual human beings with inherent rights.
Okay, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. From the obscure theology of the 19th century to the white phosphorus of 2009.
Let's try to summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive into Gaza in crisis.
I think there are three main pillars we can distill from the authors. First, the conflict is profoundly structural.
It's not just a series of unfortunate events or endless cycles of violence. It is built on a very specific historical architecture.
The dispossession of the Nakba in 1948, which is the second pillar. The Nakba is the ghost at the table.
You cannot solve the problem if you continuously ignore the root cause, which is the fate of the refugees. The attempt by diplomats to start history in 1967 is a fatal trap.
And the third pillar. The U.S. is not a neutral mediator.
It is the primary enabler. Through massive military aid, diplomatic UN vetoes, and ideological cover, the U.S. allows the status quo to persist.
The peace process, as we know it, has actually prevented peace by shielding the ongoing occupation.
Which leads us to the final, very provocative thought that the source material leaves us with.
The term that really sticks with you. Politicide.
Politicide, the deliberate murder of a nation's political existence.
I want you, the listener, to really think about this question. If the two-state solution is physically impossible because of the sprawling settlements,
and the one-state solution is politically rejected out of hand by the powers that be,
what actually happens to the millions of people living in the ghetto?
That is the terrifying reality that the book leaves us with. They are left in a permanent state of limbo, ghettoized, fragmented,
facing total political erasure. It's not necessarily a rapid physical genocide where everyone is killed at once.
No, it is a political death. A slow, agonizing strangulation of their identity and their very future as a cohesive people.
That is an incredibly sobering thought to end on. But this is exactly why we do these deep dives.
To look past the daily headlines and actually examine the heavy machinery operating underneath.
Exactly. And if you want to truly visualize this fragmentation we've been talking about, I'd encourage you to just go look at a map.
Don't just look at a standard political map. Look up a detailed map of the West Bank settlements and the divisions of areas A, B, and C.
Seeing that fragmentation with your own eyes tells the story far better than words ever could.
It really does.
Thank you for going on this very difficult journey with us today. It wasn't easy material, but it was absolutely necessary to understand. We'll see you on the next deep dive.